So I approached Sheila and said, about a month ago, wasn't it, and said I'd love to get involved with Hope Street. And before I could blink, she's brought me into doing this, so thanks for that. Okay, so I'm from Yorkshire. I've lived here now for the last 6 years. I live in Ormskirk. I love Ormskirk, I absolutely adore it. I have a son and a daughter, 19-year-old daughter, Olivia, and 22-year-old son, Kai. My son has a diagnosis of autism. He was diagnosed with autism really early. He was just 3 years old when he received his diagnosis, which is unheard of, even in today's age, let alone back then. He's very high functioning, which means that he's got a really high level of intelligence. So what I'm going to do throughout this presentation that I'm going to give is I'm going to try and give some sort of real life experiences through the eyes of my son and myself as well. Okay, so I'm not going to pretend that I've lived with autism all my life. I was diagnosed with autism 6 years ago, so I haven't lived with autism all my life. I've always known that there's, especially with my son is a mirror image of me. So I've always known I was on the spectrum myself. And curiosity had just got the better of me, and I had to just go and get myself assessed. And the outcome was that I have Asperger's syndrome, same to my son, exactly the same as my son. So I'm going to give you some examples, real life examples of how that feels for me as a person, and how some of the things that I'm going to talk about have impacted on my son and his life as well. I'm going to give you a presentation first of all. First we're going to do a little quiz just to see what you already know about autism. Then I'm going to go into a sort of an awareness around what autism is, and I'm pretty certain I know quite a few faces in the room, so I know this is going to be quite basic stuff for some of you, but I think let's start with with some general information about what autism is, and then I'm going to move into doing another presentation about the SEND code of practice, and what that means in terms of assessment processes and the support you might expect for children and young people to be getting in schools who might have special educational needs, specifically around autism rather than generally all special educational needs. So I've been, by profession I'm a teacher, a maths teacher by profession. I've been a head teacher for the last 17 years now. My last school where I was head teacher for 12 years was in one of the Merseyside local authorities. I became quite disillusioned at the fact that we were being asked as a school to provide more and more with less and less money, and frankly I got sick of being able to being expected to meet the needs of some really vulnerable children with absolutely no funding at all. So I left my course, found some exceptional partners, and we've opened our own independent school in Ormskirk, which is just behind the Builders Yard there, called Turning Point Academy, and we're a neurodiverse community. So our school caters for children who come from all over Merseyside, not just Lancashire, who largely have autism as a diagnosis. So we'll start with a quiz. I thought that there was going to be tables in the room, so I did some little slips for you to write your answers on, but I'll read the questions out and we'll do it that way instead. So the first question in this quiz is, so it's a true or false answer for these questions. All autistic people have some degree of special ability, such as an incredible memory for facts, specialist mathematical ability, or photographic memory. Is that true or false?
Should we do a hand?
Yeah, if you think it's true, put your hand up, and we'll just assume then that everyone without the hand up thinks it's false. Okay? So about a third think it's true. So the answer is false. Okay? Only 5% of people who have, not just children, people, adults as well, have like a special ability. Only 5% with a diagnosis of autism have what would be considered as a special ability. For my son, he's exceptionally bright at things like maths, always has been. Academically, he's bright with everything. He's literally smashed his GCSEs with A stars, every single subject he did. He did 12 subjects at GCSE, he did some extra ones. Not because we wanted him to as parents, because he wanted to. He did 6 A-levels and got A's in all of his A-levels as well. So, you know, he's exceptionally bright. Cursed from a social perspective, I always say, for my son, exceptionally bright academically, but socially, he is literally cursed. He cannot cope in social situations at all, and needs an awful lot of help. Okay? For me, growing up, I've always liked everything to be exceptionally ordered, right down to the way I put things down on a table. That's for me. Don't worry about it. I've learned not to go to pot with things like that. But everything for me has to be highly organised. I can't cope, even now, as I have been a head teacher for a long time, and the number of things that get thrown at you as a head teacher or a teacher in any school, left field, is just like literally 50, 60 things flying at you each day that you've not planned for. Inside I crumble. You wouldn't notice that and nobody else does. But I find that except I have to have everything really finely planned to feel that I'm coping and surviving in life.
Did that affect you in your younger days before you learned strategies
I
to
think
deal
it
with
did,
it?
yeah, definitely. It definitely
did. It come out in like different emotions, anger or upset, or was it
not
more?
necessarily anger. I think I'd say it probably came out in me becoming quite withdrawn rather than being angry. I've never been an angry person, but I'd just withdraw from situations. So even now, you know, I can stand up and do this because it's work. Everything for me is put into little boxes, and there's no mixing of those boxes. So for me, coming here, this is work. I can stand in front of an assembly of hundreds of children and staff and talk about just about anything. If I was to go to a social situation where I knew nobody, well, to start with, I wouldn't choose to do that. I'd just say, no, I'm not going. That's it. Even now, I wouldn't go. If a friend asked me to go somewhere and I knew that I knew very few people, the answer would just be, no, I don't want to go, I'm not going. I wouldn't even attempt to go. So that's the sort of, through life, that's been me.
Have you learned to mask it?
Pardon?
Have you learned to mask the situation by like using distractions?
I think I'm probably like my son and a lot of people with autism. We're masters at disguising autism. You know, it's an invisible. Autism is an invisible disability. You wouldn't look at me, I don't think, and say, oh, Mike's got autism. And you wouldn't look at my son and think that either. Probably with my son, you'd think he was a bit quirky, and for his age, he's always called quirky. But he's very well spoken. He's not got a Yorkshire accent. I don't know how he's escaped that. But he's you know, you can't tell. And with most people with autism, it's a hidden. It's very much like a hidden disability. What I'm just going to ask is that people don't ask questions in between. Is that all right? I'll pause for questions.
Sorry.
Otherwise, we won't get through this at all. It'll be, we'll have to come back like several more times to finish it off. So the next question is, autistic women and girls are often diagnosed later or misdiagnosed entirely.
True.
Yeah. True, hands up, yeah? Yeah, that's very true. Even now in school, we've got in school over 60 children on roll, and 94% of those children are boys, very few girls. That's not because the girls haven't got autism, it's because the assessment procedures have all been geared to, the norms of an assessment for autism have all been geared to boys over a very long period of time. There are more and more girls coming through with diagnoses of autism. Also, when I say norms of assessment, girls present very differently to boys who have autism. The same can be said of girls who have other neurodevelopmental conditions like ADHD. They present very differently. So often it's really difficult because people always have in mind the way that boys display traits of autism. So it's not necessarily that there are less people with autism who are female. Women and girls tend to mask their difficulties more successfully than boys do. That's just the science of men and women. That's the science of it. Okay, so next question. Autism is always a barrier to living a successful and fulfilling life. For example, getting married, having a family, owning a house, holding down a good job. And the cue there is autism is always a barrier. Is that true or false?
False.
It's probably a bit of both, really, isn't it? It is mainly false, but for a lot of people, it's very true. You know, many autistic people do get married. They work, and they have very successful adult lives. However, many struggle to gain employment because they haven't got the ability or skills to socially interact in a manner that society finds appropriate. Okay? And I have quite a lot of debate with my son about this, where I say, well, actually, when things happen that upset him, or when he upsets other people and he's not quite got why that's happened, and we talk about social norms and what society will accept, and he just can't understand why society can't just mould around him instead. And to some extent, that's what we do need to do in society, I think, but we're a long way away from that, really. So figures from the National Autistic Society indicate that only 22% of autistic adults are in any kind of employment. So when we say that statement's false, the fact is that there are very few people with a diagnosis of autism in full-time employment, which is really sad, because the majority of people who have autism have a lot to offer, an awful lot to offer. And this highlights the need for greater understanding and support for autistic adults within the workplace. Very recently, my son, he's come back from university. How he got through university, I have no idea. He went to London to go to university. That was 5 years of being on pins and needles, I'll tell you. He did well in university academically. Socially, he had a lot of struggles. He's come back home to try and get a job, and he's finding it really difficult. He's finding the interview process is really difficult. He's finding interacting with people really difficult. And he's really bright. He's got a lot to offer somebody. So that's just one example. Next question then. Autism is a childhood disorder and people grow out of it.
False.
False, yeah, false. The number of times I hear people say, but he'll grow out of it, is just, even now, people, I have parents come to me thinking, it won't always be like this, will it? He'll grow out of it. No, autism is a lifelong condition. A neurodevelopmental condition is a lifelong condition. It doesn't go away. What happens is people learn to mask it really well, usually. Okay, you learn how to cope. You learn how to avoid certain situations. That's what I do. If I know I'm going to go to a stressful situation, I try and avoid it. So that's what lots of people with autism end up doing. So next question then is, autistic adults are always well supported and able to achieve their full potential. False. False. Now you say false. And I thought it was false as well. The answer to this is a quiz from the National Autistic Society, by the way. I've not invented it myself. The answer from them is that it's true. I'm not sure that is true, to be fair. That's not my experience, and I wouldn't say that is my son's experience either. So their answer is that support for autistic adults is often dependent on where they live, rather than their level of need. I'd sort of agree with that because I've worked in lots of local authorities, lots of councils, and it is a postcode lottery, unfortunately. I'd say that the support for people with any sort of additional needs here is quite shocking in Lancashire compared to where I've worked before, I would say. And I thought it was bad where I worked before, but here it's quite poor. Probably because of budget cuts and lots of other things, but it doesn't seem to be much available really. So that's my experience of being a working adult in this community really. Next question then is, autism is a barrier to education. Have we got any parents here with children who have autism or you think may? Yeah, okay. So is education a barrier to children or adults with autism?
Can be without the support. Yeah.
Do you think, who thinks that's true? Yeah, yeah, okay. So again, I think it's a bit of each, isn't it? Being autistic is not a barrier to education in some ways, and it is in others. Okay, many autistic adults have had a very difficult journey through their primary and secondary education within a school system that may struggle to adapt to their learning differences. I think sometimes, working with lots of secondary schools in particular, there's a lack of willingness to adapt to a child's specific needs. And there are some really small changes that schools can put in that would make all the difference. My son went successfully through mainstream secondary school, which had something called a designated special provision attached to it. And it wasn't a provision where children went out away from the main bit of school somewhere else in a corner of school. It was a hub where he could go to get support if he felt that he needed to. It was his anchor place to go, and that is where we spent a lot of break and lunch times because that's what he needed. And for the rest of the time, he survived really well through the whole of his secondary school. It was quite a small secondary school, which was a good thing. He travelled about 25 miles away to go to the school, but it was important to him and us as a family that he stayed in mainstream education because he was really bright. Okay, there's very few places that are a halfway house, I think. You've either got schools that are going to be able to successfully cater for children who can cope with the academic rigour of school, or the other end would be special school provision, which is mainly for children who are very disabled. And there's no real in-between there. I'd say apart from my school, because you come to my school and it's like a small mainstream school, you would not be able to guess that the pupils in my school had autism if you saw them. They get on really well because they get a lot of scaffolding in terms of the social aspect of school, and you don't get that in a mainstream school successfully very often. There are pockets of it and there's some really good practice. But I think sometimes mainstream schools really struggle with providing children with the support they need, the bit of support they might need around the social times of schooling. So my next question is, sensory overload can be a significant source of stress for many autistic adults or children. True. I think that's the cause of the majority of upset and meltdowns, and when children and adults get themselves into crisis, it's because of something to do with the environment around them, with sensory input, sensory overload. So, and it doesn't affect everybody, it affects people in very different ways, indeed. We'll go into that a little bit more in the presentation. You can always tell, this is the next question, if someone is autistic. True or false? False. You can. It's impossible to tell. Autism really is a hidden disability, which means that there are no physical characteristics that easily identify someone as being autistic. And that's a real challenge for people who have autism and the people around them. Probably one of the biggest challenges for people who have autism. So this can affect how the autistic person is treated in that difficulties that are core to their disability can be punished rather than supported. I go back to that school environment again. Quite often that's what happens. They end up being punished as a result of their disability rather than being supported. And a lot of the time that's not done on purpose. Schools and it happens in other environments as well, aren't purposely doing that. They're not going out of their way to completely disregard somebody's disability. It's just really hard. This notion that, well, you have to do that because everybody else does, or you have to do that because I say it, does not wash with an autistic person. It doesn't wash with me even now. If someone says, I've got to do something just because they've said, well, that's just a red flag to a bull for me. Even now at 48 years old, that will just really annoy me, and I mean really annoy me. And most of the time, if you see a young person, certainly in my setting, in an educational setting, who's at crisis, it's because of something really simple that somebody's told them they can't do when they probably actually could have done it, to be fair. And people aren't prepared to bend and square even the slightest. Yeah, so these are little changes I'm talking about here, not massive things. So the next question is, there are a plethora of labels that describe autistic people, some of which are unhelpful. True or false? True, isn't it? True. So we've got labels like, I hate the label, by the way, autistic spectrum condition or disorder. The word condition or disorder always makes me cringe a little bit. I wouldn't know, if you ask me what would you call it, then I've no idea. I don't like having a label. It's not important to me. Very few people in my life actually know I was diagnosed with autism, because it's not important for me to tell people at all. Probably because I've learned that I can cope without people knowing. So I've coped for a very long time without really having that label myself. And we often talk to parents in education about having a diagnosis is not going to change anything overnight. It literally is a label. It doesn't change your child's behaviour, how they respond. It's the people around the child that need to make some changes in terms of how they respond to need and how they meet need, not the child. Yeah. There's lots of it. We'll go on to labels when I do the presentation in more detail. And my last question is all people with autism lack empathy? True?
False.
False. It is false. But it is a really common misconception that a lot of people instantly think that people with autism aren't loving and caring because they can't show any emotion. It couldn't be further from the truth. I know some people that are like that, but I know the majority of people I know with autism are just, very caring individuals. The number of times I hear, and it's still on, there's a lot of different tools for assessing children with autism, and on some of the diagnostic tools, it still has that bit about eye contact. I know a lot of people with autism that can show very good eye contact because you learn that it's acceptable to have to do that. You might not like it, it might be a bit uncomfortable at times, but you learn over your life that actually it's socially acceptable to do that, and therefore it becomes the norm. People with autism and other conditions, like other neurodevelopmental conditions, are creatures of habit. Sometimes those habits are very unhealthy and not very good habits to have, and it's certainly wherever I've worked, it's been quite a hard job then to uncouple unhealthy, unhelpful habits and equip the child or young person with a set of habits that are going to be more successful for them. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So that's just a little bit of information just to stimulate a little bit of thought, really. Any burning questions from that? No? We're going to move on now to this quite big